Hello, today we're going to discuss fiction and we're going to use our annotation skill, annotating meaning to take notes, our fictional annotation skill. What that means is we have to consider how the author is communicating. Authors of fiction communicate themselves very differently than authors of nonfiction, or what we would call informational text. Authors of fiction are going to utilize what we refer to as the elements of fiction to communicate their ideas. So in order to understand level 1 of reading comprehension, main ideas, using or reading fictional literature under the genre of fiction, which is the creative work of the imagination, we need to be taking notes on certain aspects such as characterization, all of the details we find out about minor and major characters, the events of the story or the plot development where those characters find themselves, the setting, conflicts. These can be internal or external, such as character versus self or character versus character, and then the subsequent resolutions that arise from these conflicts. Once we really understand well how to draw out these main ideas, and this is what we're annotating for, main ideas, what are the main ideas that the author or authors are communicating, what are the themes that they're building, how are they building those brick by brick through motifs, for example. We begin with level 1, annotating for these 5 elements of fiction. Then we can move on to analysis. For example, if we read A Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes novel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, we can simply write the plot development beginning to middle to end. This will be annotating for main ideas. But if we want to take it to step 2, now we can write about analepsis, a very specific rhetorical device under the umbrella of plot development. This is what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle most noticeably is doing with his plot development at the beginning, and as we move towards the end of the story, we notice this more prevalently than other devices, especially under the umbrella of plot development. Then we move on to critical thinking, which we provide our own analysis. We're forming a judgment. This is subjective. We decide whether or not we thought analepsis, for example, was a good idea. If so, we support that with quotes and explain what we mean when we say that it was a great choice. If we don't think it was a good choice, now we can offer alternatives and explain why or how that didn't quite work as well and what would. And this is really what we're after with our fictional annotations. This can help us in both classical literature, reading like a novel study in our classes. It also can help us on standardized exams such as SATs, ACTs, PSAT, SSAT, on and on, the reading comprehension strategies of our standardized testing. Now let's take a look at one particular novel. Today we're looking at Lord of the Flies, just an excerpt here at the very beginning where we are going to annotate for these 5 elements of fiction. By the way, Lord of the Flies is about a group of boys who, in order to escape war in their country, the UK, they escape on an airplane that unfortunately is attacked and crashes onto an island. Here they must create their own society. And these are where all the conflicts arise. One main theme that William Golding is attempting to communicate through these elements in his novel, a dominant theme would be that human nature is evil. And we really see a lot of that throughout the novel. Now let's go ahead and take a look at chapter 1. This is called The Sound of the Shell. The shell actually is a very powerful symbol in the novel. It's a conch shell that the boys decide will give whoever is holding it leadership powers and the ability to speak in their little democracy, their little society that they're trying to create. Ironically, it becomes also a symbol of the fragility, the precariousness of democracy, that it can easily be shattered, and that it really only holds power when the group decides that it does. A social contract, if you will. Let's take a look at chapter 1 here, The Sound of the Shell. We'll only take a look briefly here so that we can get used to our 5 elements of fiction. The boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way toward the lagoon. Though he had taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand, his gray shirt stuck to him and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. "Hi," it said, "wait a minute!" The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken with a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. "Wait a minute," the voice said, "I got caught up." The fair boy stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungle seem for a moment like the home counties. The voice spoke again. "I can't hardly move with all these creeper things." The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that twigs scratched on a greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks of his knees were plump, caught and scratched by thorns. He bent down, removed the thorns carefully, and turned around. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. He came forward, searching out safe lodgments for his feet, and then looked up through thick spectacles. Now here we can focus first on characterization. We have a boy with fair hair being contrasted or juxtaposed to this boy who is plump and has thick spectacles. Now throughout the novel, this comes to represent the attractive boy who will be elected leader because he's physically attractive, and the boys appreciate that. He's athletic and good looking. And then we have our other character who is not as physically attractive, and so he really draws the ire of the boys and becomes bullied for being plump and having thick glasses. What's interesting about this character, and he's referred to as Piggy throughout the entire novel, his name is never revealed and the boys never ask. But what's interesting is that he's very complex. The reason why he's overweight is that his parents have died at a young age for him, and his aunt who owns a bake shop has adopted him, and he's been emotionally eating to deal with the trauma of losing his parents at a young age. We also have some information here on the setting. We can highlight for setting. We see a lagoon, a jungle, red and yellow bird, creeper things, undergrowth. We're getting an idea here of where they are. And as far as plot development is concerned, the events of the story, we also see that they have caused this long scar to be smashed into the jungle. And that they're sort of walking around, talking to each other, trying to figure out where they are. Now let's continue. "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. "This is an island. At least I think it's an island. That's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. "There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger cabin. He was up in front." The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. "All them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out. They must have, mustn't they?" The fair boy began to pick his way as casually as possible toward the water. He tried to be offhand and not too obviously uninterested, but the fat boy hurried after him. "Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the delight of a realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. "No grown-ups!" The fat boy thought for a moment. "That pilot." The fair boy allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. "He must have flown off after he dropped us. He couldn't land here, not in a plane with wheels. We was attacked." "He'll be back all right." The fat boy shook his head. "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it." He looked up and down the scar. "And this is what the cabin done." The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of a trunk. For a moment he looked interested. "What happened to it?" he asked. "Where's it got to now?" "That storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all them tree trunks falling. There must have been some kids still in it." Now here we can see the tone is pretty dark, as we have a missing pilot and children who presumably have perished. We find out with our plot development here that they have been attacked, and that their plane has crashed onto this island. And that the storm has dragged the plane wreckage back out to sea. And for setting, we see that we're
on an island. Now what's interesting about this island is that really it's more like an experiment. Imagine a social psychological experiment. What would happen if we took a group of boys, threw them onto an island, a group of boys around the age of 12, some a bit younger, took away the social constraints that presumably keep them from killing each other, and what would happen in that experiment? This island sort of representing the subconscious now. This sort of fantasy world within the psychological mind. And a thought experiment, if you will, is what William Golding has presented here. And the results are grim. They do end up murdering each other by the end of the novel, and it really is an exploration of human evil. We're already getting some ideas here about motifs that will develop throughout the novel, such as civilization versus savagery, humanity versus animality, technology versus nature, hunters versus gatherers, men versus women, adults versus children, the intellect versus physicality, on and on and on. Actually, William Golding will present every single conflict within this novel. The characters have internal struggles, they're facing each other physically and mentally. Nature is threatening to kill them. Nature does end up killing a few. The supernatural, they think there's a demon on the island. It's really just their own evil. Their plane has been washed out to sea. War has brought them here to the island, and they must make their own society, and that has its own problems as well. Every single conflict is presented in this novel. It is quite complex. Great, let's remove our notes here. This is how we would want to write our notes down. We have a fair-haired boy, the fat boy with thick spectacles. The boys have crashed onto an island. They realize that the only adult the pilot is missing, and maybe some children as well. They land on this island where the plane has caused a long scar to smash into the jungle. And the conflict so far seems to be just that the boys are shaken, traumatized, lost. We might have some man versus nature already arising. And all of this we can gather just from the first few lines here. This is how we annotate for our 5 elements of fiction, using classical literature here as the example, because those are always the best. We're going to always have a very complex interweaving together of these 5 elements when we read literature that's considered to be classic or the best of the best.